Hello and welcome back, my listeners. How are you all doing? I am so excited to introduce you to my guest on the podcast. And he is someone that I discovered through the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Church News podcast. And when it came up on my feed, I was like, who is this person? And I need to listen to him. And I actually had to listen to the interview twice because it was packed with so much information. A lot of this information I came to learn for myself because of my own journey going through my own separation. And and I found them to be so true in principle, in gospel, and in line with everything that Jesus Christ has been teaching his whole entire life and continues to try and teach us. And so I want to introduce you to Dr. Toussaint, who is a professor at Luther College, and he calls himself the forgiveness expert. So now, before I have him introduce himself to you, you're probably thinking, how can someone possibly be a forgiveness expert? And I'm going to allow him to explain that and have this conversation about forgiveness, especially as women going through separation and divorce. And we know deep down inside that forgiveness is somewhere on the table when it comes to our ex spouse. But right now, it might not be the time to do that. And that is okay. But I hope that even though it may not seem like it's the right time for you emotionally, spiritually, mentally, that I hope that you will stay with us in this conversation. And I promise you that you will be able to take away one key thing from what he has to say. And that might be the very beginning of a journey of forgiveness that will emerge from your experience. And that is my hope and prayer for you. So now to continue on with or to begin this conversation, Dr. Toussaint, would you like to introduce yourself and how you became the forgiveness expert?
Well, thank you. I get asked the question often how I got interested in forgiveness. It wasn't hard. I have a very Christian upbringing and one that instituted in me a value of forgiveness from a very, very early age. And so it just seemed like a very natural thing to do for me that if there was a way that I could contribute to the world in some useful or meaningful way, it was probably through some teaching that I learned from the gospel very early on and continued to rehearse and reread and contemplate about. As far as being a forgiveness expert goes, I like to think of myself as someone who's a student of forgiveness. I've never stopped trying to learn more about it. It's one of the great things about my job that it offers me the opportunity to continue to study and learn more about forgiveness. I've been doing that for now over 20 years. Whether I'm an expert or not is not my it's not my choice to make. I'll let the listeners decide about that. I think I've probably thought about the topic maybe a little bit more than some, and probably a little bit less than others. But what I've learned, I like to take any and every opportunity I get to share it, because I think it's something that no matter what walk of life you find yourself in, we all have our forgiveness stories, and that's part of living in a broken world. So I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And as I was doing some research on you, I found that not only are you teaching and instilling and encouraging forgiveness where you are teaching, like at Luther College, but you've expanded this like globally. Can you talk more about what you chair, and then we'll revisit again at the end of the podcast for anyone that is interested in wanting to be part of this movement and and what you want to really foster.
Yeah, it's fantastic, really. I'm the chair of the Discover Forgiveness Advisory Council for the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and you can find the work that we're doing at discoverforgiveness.org. We're really trying to build a global movement that is one that is informed by forgiveness, and that shares the tools and methodologies of helping people to become more forgiving, understanding the benefits, understanding what it is, and then understanding how we can study it and learn more about it scientifically and critically. Our aim is to spread this, as I said, worldwide. So it's not, it's not specific to any one particular geographic place or any one particular country. Right now, we're doing a study on forgiveness in Trinidad, which is the southernmost island in the Caribbean. And many other studies are going on, funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation around the world in places that you might not think of off the top of your head: Ukraine, Africa, Colombia, um, you know, just all over the world. Studies that we've done in India and so forth. And so, really, the brilliance of the Templeton World Charity Foundation is that they've identified forgiveness as being a truly important aspect of human flourishing, and making it a goal, and a goal that we work toward day in and day out, to educate people about forgiveness.
That's so amazing. It's so beautiful. And, with what's going on in our country, in our states, in our cities, and then just re-expanding that out globally, we see so much need for forgiveness, right? And because of the turmoil and the wars that are going on.
Yeah, I think there's a long-standing adage about war is not the answer. Um, and I think we could all agree that that's probably true. War is not the answer. But if we agree on that, we have to probably think about, well, what's the alternative?
Yeah.
And forgiveness is one of the things that, unfortunately, doesn't rise to the top of the list often. It's something that it can be hard to do. It is something that is often misunderstood, and so I think for some of those reasons, it's not a first option often.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's just kind of begin at the very beginning. And so in social science and as a psychologist, how do you define forgiveness?
Yeah, that's great. It's a great place to start because, in any science, the foundation of the work is about definition, right? It's about understanding exactly what it is that you're studying. And um, even in sciences that we think of as being, these kinds of enterprises that have really tried and true laws, and they understand how nature works, things like physics, and they even somewhat have differences of opinion about whether or not light should be considered a wave or a photon. And so definitions are absolutely critical
Yeah.
across all sciences. And when I think about studying forgiveness, that's the one thing that comes first to mind is, what are you talking about? Well, I think sometimes, I use the analogy often of going to a buffet restaurant and figuring out what you really enjoy there. Part of figuring out what you really enjoy is figuring out what you really don't enjoy. And so you kind of, understand what it is that you're talking about, sometimes by understanding what you're not talking about. And so in defining forgiveness, one thing that we know for sure is that it's not reconciliation. It's not putting back together a relationship. That might happen in some instances, but it is neither a requirement or a guaranteed outcome. It does not have to take place. People can forgive, they can release negative feelings, and never again be in a relationship with someone. And so, we think of forgiveness as being something that comes from within you. It's a what we call an intrapersonal experience within you. Reconciliation is an interpersonal experience between two people. So I think it's really important that we start by clarifying that we're not talking at all about reconciliation. I mean, we leave the door open there; it's a possibility, but not a requirement. The same is true and can be said for justice, that a lot of times people will take justice on one end of the continuum, forgiveness on the other, and say, somewhere in between here is where we are aiming to get. We want to either get a lot of justice, or we're willing to offer a lot of forgiveness. I think that's entirely a misconstrual of these two notions. Justice is something that happens in the social order. It's something that is oftentimes codified in law. It has evolved over maybe decades or centuries in some cases. It is really a social and legal process, and so sometimes things happen for which justice is required by law. Sometimes things happen for which there is no legal precedent or any reason why it would go into a legal system. And you can think of all kinds of instances that wouldn't rise to the level of needing legal action. But the other thing about justice and forgiveness is that oftentimes people think if they get justice, they might be able to, in some way, also forgive. Like somehow one might flow from the other. But what I can tell you is that in my experience, that sometimes does happen, but so too does the opposite sometimes happen. People don't get justice and they don't forgive. But the thing that people oftentimes don't consider is that sometimes people get perfect justice and they never forgive.
Wow.
Other times people get no justice and they forgive completely.
Yeah.
And so it's really a common confusion that you get an either or in terms of justice and forgiveness. And really it can be a both and, neither or one or the other. And that makes for kind of a complex understanding of what forgiveness and justice is, but it is our reality. And so there are many situations in which someone simply may never get justice for what was done to them, but they might be able to consider forgiving. In other cases, they might get justice and forget about forgiveness. It may never cross their mind again.
Yeah.
But so we start by saying, forgiveness is not reconciliation. It's not justice. It's also not forgetting, which is the common cultural adage, is that you forgive and forget. And I would say the very reason you need to work on forgiveness is that you can't forget. And the human mind has evolved adaptively so that you won't forget. There's reasons why you shouldn't forget typically,
Yeah.
especially if you've been in harm's way, if there's been a threat to your safety in some way. The last thing you should be trying to do is forget about that. That's not adaptive. That's not protective. It's not going to, prolong your survival in any meaningful way. So you need to remember, but just because you're remembering doesn't mean that you can't forgive. And that's an important distinction, is that forgiveness is about, really thinking about the ways in which you're remembering and trying to move beyond just a simple memory that is an offensive one. The other couple things that I should mention is that forgiveness is not condoning bad behavior. The phrase "boys will be boys" is a common way of describing when boys or men get rambunctious or physical or violent. It's the phrase is "boys will be boys." That's just condoning bad behavior, and that's not what
Yeah.
forgiveness is. Again, the reason you need to forgive is because that's not okay, right? That's not okay. It's not it's not just looking past something, in other words, and saying that things that shouldn't be are actually just fine. So those are all things that forgiveness is not, but I still haven't really discussed the point of what it is. And there's many different ways. Like I said, you can define light in multiple ways. You can define forgiveness in multiple ways. But a key thing from my perspective is when you forgive someone, your levels of hatred toward them and all the negative emotions and all the negative thoughts and all the kind of negative intentions and motivations you might have toward them reduce. That's a key part of forgiveness. And then the kind of hopeful part of forgiveness, a critical second element here, is not just that you've reduced those things, but that you're in some way able to add back in something of a more positive nature. And so you might not feel a great deal of loving affection towards someone who hurt you, but you might actually be able to appreciate that they're a valued human being, right? At very least, you can
Yeah.
recognize their human dignity, and shouldn't want them to suffer and be in pain. You might not want to, bring them flowers or, gifts in any other way. But you might not, you might be willing to say a kind hello, right? So instead of averting your gaze and turning in the other direction, you might be able to muster up the ability to just say hello, right? And that might be all that you're able to do. But there's some important recognition that it's not just the reduction of the negative things, but it's also building back some aspect of positive intention toward another human being. And that can mean lots of different things. And it doesn't have to mean a lot, but it means something, right? That you're recognizing their human value, their
Yeah.
humanness. So I think that's, in a nutshell, forgiveness is not these other things. But then what is it? Well, it's reducing the kind of volcanic eruption of all these different aspects of negativity, emotionally, behaviorally, motivationally, and cognitively, reducing all the negativity there and trying to replace it some with a little bit of positivity. Sometimes we think of this as using more of a positive psychological experience to contaminate a negative psychological experience and to maybe dilute it some to kind of extinguish some of its power. That's often what people say, or I think are aiming at when they recognize, they see you and they say, boy, you look really glum today. Is something bothering you? And you say, well, work's not going so great or whatever. And, my kids are bothering me or whatever. And somebody says, well, look on the bright side, put a smile on your face. You got lots of things. And what they're trying to do is to emphasize or draw out of you some element of positivity to contaminate that negative experience with. The two things don't really coexist really well together often. So
Yeah.
that's kind of our attempt. A couple of other things that I'd say about forgiveness in terms of defining it is you want to be really clear that there's both a kind of a head and a heart aspect to this. You can decide to forgive someone and really be committed to wanting to do that. But just because you make that decision, sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean that your heart's going to feel open and full immediately. And that's, probably true of other aspects of our experience as well, right? I might decide I want to, become more active and more fit. And, that decision is going to bring with it some distinctive pain in the next couple of days and weeks until I start to actually really feel better. And the same thing is true with forgiveness, is that a lot of times it's not uncharacteristic that things might feel a little bit worse before they get better.
Yeah.
And the point is to stay committed to that decision and and remain hopeful and focused on the experience that's likely to come if you stay with it. So it's both kind of a head, a decision, and a heart, kind of an emotion. And people sometimes are really easily defeated because they say, it just doesn't, I'm not feeling it. It's not vibing for me right now, whatever. I'm just not in the groove of forgiveness. I still hate this person. Yeah, it's probably normal. I mean, that's not to be unexpected. Just because your head told you you're ready to do something doesn't mean that your heart's ready to follow yet. And so that's our hope, is that, eventually the two things kind of come together and you stay committed to it. But it's hard for that reason.
Yeah. And that I love how you explained that about the head and heart, because I think that's what you meant by that forgiveness is intrapersonal versus
Yeah.
interpersonal when it comes to reconciliation. And it also sounds to me, and from what you were saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that forgiveness doesn't have to happen the moment you decide. In other words, like complete alignment of head and heart.
Yeah.
Like it's okay and we have permission for this to take a while.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, anybody that's been a student of forgiveness for any amount of time knows that this is really hard to predict in many ways. You may gain some benefit from an immediate kind of engagement with forgiveness, thinking about it, maybe even kind of reflecting on it, journaling on it, praying on it, meditating on it, whatever it is that helps you. You might gain some benefit, but again, like if I can, use the example of like an exercise program, a lot of times you do see kind of almost immediate benefits. You feel like, there's, oh, hey, I didn't notice I had that muscle or something. It's like, that's
Yeah.
really, really nice. But, it's kind of it's a short-term gain that might, it might carry you a little bit further until you can start to recognize even more benefits, and the truth is that often I think real lasting forgiveness does take time. That's one thing that we know from the science, is that the more time that you spend on it, the more of a benefit you get. And the social scientists, and for that matter, scientists in health and medicine would call this a dose response
Mhm.
curve, which says that, if you think about how much time you're spending thinking about forgiveness and working toward it, that's the dose of forgiveness that you're getting.
Got it.
And the bigger the dose that you get, the more time you spend, the more engaged you are, the more activities you do, the more kinds of things you try to, the bigger the benefit. And so it's not surprising. I mean, again, lots of things in life are that way. The more you put into it, the more you get out of it.
Yeah.
So, but I think it is hard, because our culture is one that's enamored with sensationalism. And there are examples of people who have been horrendously offended, and the next day they're kind of standing on the church steps, proclaiming their forgiveness of the murderer, or the offender in whatever way. And God bless those people. I'm not one of them. It
Yeah.
when people hurt me, it takes a long time for me to get past that. And I think for most of us, that's what it consists of, right? Forgiveness is something that we sometimes maybe don't want to talk about because we're not really good at it, because we're not, maybe feel a little bit ashamed of ourselves, or
Yeah.
worried that we're not as good as we should be. But I think that's just the natural course of forgiveness, is that it takes time and it takes effort.
Yeah. And I'm just reminded of just something that Jesus said in the Gospels, when someone, I think it was Simon Peter, that asked him, like, how long does it take, or what was the question he had?
How many times?
How many times should I forgive him? And Jesus says, what, 70 times 70?
Yeah.
And I don't think that it has necessarily to do with the fact that it equals to 4,900, but that
No.
he's basically saying it's going to take time. And it
Yeah.
might take 490 tries, just
Yep.
trying to to get there, to
Yep.
just learn about forgiveness. And just going back to the dosage, I was also thinking about your analogy of like being of exercising, is what if forgiveness is a muscle,
Yeah.
and you're making a goal of running the marathon of forgiveness.
Yeah.
Like, you don't go out there and running 26 plus miles in one day. Like, you're like just starting, like maybe it's
Yeah.
a half a mile and you're just walking it, right?
Right.
And then the
Right.
next day you're walking it again, and the next day you're walking half of it. And maybe in a year, maybe in 3 years, you might be ready for that marathon, maybe. But it
Yeah.
sounds like forgiveness is the long game, and there's no shame in it being the long game.
No, there's really not. I mean, some people, I think, they might work on forgiveness issues their entire life. I mean,
Yeah.
there's nothing to be apologetic about in that regard. If the only thing to be ashamed of is, if you let it overcome you, perhaps, and don't consider, if your heart is not at all open. In fact, Jesus again makes it pretty clear that about the only thing that is unforgivable is unforgiveness. And um, if you do not forgive others their sins, my heavenly Father will not forgive you. And
Yeah.
that makes it pretty blatantly clear to me. That is an incredibly high standard, and yet, the Lord's grace is all around us, and we're just oftentimes not attending to it in ways that we need to or could. But with His grace, we can hope to be able to forgive. It might take us a long time because we're human, limited, and broken, right? But
Yeah.
the idea of not trying is probably the thing that is the most disconcerting. Trying, there's nothing wrong with trying. There's nothing wrong with failing. All of
Yeah.
us have done that.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think, in some cases, people find kind of, in psychology, we have a phenomenon that we call insight. And insight is what occurs when you've been really working on a problem and thinking about it very carefully and trying to come to the solution. And then, one day you're out in the back of your back in your garden, hoeing out weeds in between your tomatoes, and all of a sudden, bammo, the thing just clicks for you, and you oh, that's what I should do. And for some people, I think forgiveness can be that way, and sometimes it can come almost effortlessly at a particular moment. They might have a stroke of forgiveness insight. And, when that happens, that's great. But I think we're probably talking about things that are often less common, right? That it's sure, insight is a wonderful thing. It's a gift
Yeah.
from God. But we certainly don't rely on insight to balance our checkbooks. I mean, it's like that requires careful thought. And so we probably can't rely on insight for forgiveness either. But it does happen. So I wouldn't want to exclude the possibility that for some people, forgiveness might happen kind of quickly and easily. And like I said, for those people for which that happens, wonderful.
Yeah. I love that. Um, and it sounds like it's not only a head and heart, but it could also be God. It could also be the spirit coming in. And and we can begin the process with just a desire to forgive. Or maybe even desire might be too strong of a word for someone that's going through divorce. But maybe I know I need to forgive. And maybe that is the beginning. I know I need to forgive. So I'm just going to kind of put it right here in a little corner of my brain that I can start like maybe revisiting every once in a while, and
Yeah.
start looking for 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 understanding as to how to do this is what it sounds like. And
Yeah.
so why does it matter that we forgive? Like you matter on a global level. I mean, because you're part of this global mission. But then let's just zooming it back down to just the home front. Why does it matter?
Um, that is a fantastic question. And let me, if I can just for a minute,
Yeah.
postpone that question, because there was something in the earlier remarks that I want to just add to real quickly. And that is,
Yeah.
um, in terms of finding a way, dedicating a piece of your neural tissue to thinking and considering about forgiveness. I should add that, we've done studies about prayer that just 3 minutes of prayer can change your kind of experience toward a relationship partner.
Oh, wow.
And the thing that I'm reminded of again in the gospel is that, um, the apostles asked Jesus, you know, how, teach us how to pray. How do we do this? And he essentially says, you know, uh, you're worrying too much about it, right? And he gives us like the simplest prayer that we probably have. Um, and I think for some of us, that's how we confront the notion of forgiveness. Is I don't know what to ask for here. I'm
Yes.
exhausted. I'm at wit's end. I've got nothing left. Yeah, that's right. That's typical, right?
Yeah.
That's how it works with God. When we finally realize we've got nothing left to offer in terms of a solution to this problem, that's when we finally realize maybe I should pray about this, right? This is something that I might not have the answer for, but God sure does. I just don't know what it is, right? And just because we're praying doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to change instantly. But I think it's really an important mechanism. Well, not really an important. It is the most important mechanism from my Christian viewpoint, regarding forgiveness. Is that we simply have to ask for help, right? No one is going to go to this in really clear-eyed, calm, rational fashion, and say, this is exactly what I think I should do. Right? It's just, so
I'm so excited to forgive
yeah,
my ex-spouse. This is going to be
right, right.
awesome. I was like,
Yeah,
no, let's run away.
probably not. Yeah, yeah. But I think it really, the seeds of this are planted like that mustard seed,
Yeah.
in prayer. And
Yeah.
so, I just wanted to comment on that because I think we were talking about the common experience of kind of like, can I, in any way, shape, or form, open even just the smallest little crack in my heart to the possibility of forgiveness? And I think that happens often through prayer. So,
Yeah.
but you asked about, so I paused the other question, which is like, why does this matter? Why would, um, you know, why would you spend over 20 years studying forgiveness and teaching forgiveness to all kinds of different people and talking about it? Um, it it matters. I mean, far and away, most importantly, um, it matters because it matters to God, right? That should be good enough, right? That should be, good
Yeah.
enough that we were asked to do this. You know, the thing that's hard about this is we said that it oftentimes comes kind of slow. It's kind of messy. We don't know how to, begin this. We just talked about that. Um, and it's a lot like, many things that we do. The benefits of what we're doing now, we often don't see until later. But what I can say is that one of the things that's kind of refreshing about forgiveness is that people, when they start to engage in this process, they start to feel a sense of their kind of spirituality changing, becoming more open. They start to get maybe even just a glimmer of meaning or something out of, or maybe even just the search for meaning where they haven't really tried to understand before.
Yeah.
There might be some depth of, relationship sanctification of your suffering in some way that becomes meaningful to people. Oftentimes mental health benefits are associated with even, uh, some of the research on forgiveness interventions that, um, people will do a workbook, that is a couple hours in length, 2-3 hours in length. My mentor, Everett Worthington, has got a workbook that he, gives to people, and they spend 2-3 hours working through these exercises, and reliably, scientifically validated, outcomes of going through this workbook are that people feel more hopeful, and they feel less anxious and more, they feel less anxious and less depressed, and they have higher levels of what we call flourishing, just the overall well-being. So there can be almost immediate mental health benefits that result from engaging in even just a really short amount of work on forgiveness. Of course, there are longer term benefits if you engage for a long enough period of time. A lot of times people try to become more forgiving, and if it becomes kind of a lifelong goal, they become more forgiving people. More forgiving people enjoy better physical health. They got fewer kind of bodily aches and pains and complaints. They got less pain. They have less of all kinds of different physical health conditions and problems. In one study, a really big study of over 40,000 people, we found that people who are more forgiving, they experience fewer heart problems. And we have other data suggesting that your kind of stress response, what people oftentimes call the fight or flight experience that you feel in your kind of in your gut and in your lungs, that response is calmed or cooled by the experience of forgiveness. And so, mental health issues that result from bearing a grudge and wanting revenge and remaining angry, a lot of that is extinguished, and mental health is allowed to flourish. Physical health problems, take on a different shape, and physiologically, the mechanisms that give you physical health and mental health problems start to calm and cool. And then things like just your overall level of kind of life satisfaction and happiness is elevated considerably as a result of forgiveness. And even things like one of my kind of favorite studies about forgiveness is that they had more forgiving people and less forgiving people standing at the bottom of a hill, and they asked both groups to just estimate how steep do you think the incline of that hill is. The more forgiving people estimated that the climb they were about to make was an easier one, right? The hill was less steep than the
Yeah.
people that are less forgiving. And I think that kind of goes to the notion of optimism and kind of what you expect. You're carrying a lighter load, and all hills look smaller when you're, freed of that, weighty pack that you're stacking your unforgiving bricks in. So there's just social benefits. Relationships often kind of improve satisfaction with those relationships, commitment to those relationships, whatever kinds of relationships they might be, spousal relationships, parent-child relationships, family and friend relationships. I sometimes say that forgiveness is the grease that allows the social gears to turn. All of the different networks that we're part of, yeah, socially, family-wise, in the community, at work, there's just a easier kind of fluidity to a forgiving person and how they interact in those social circles. So,
Yeah.
so benefits of
So many.
forgiveness are just everywhere, and I would
Yeah.
argue that that's why this matters. That's why this matters. It's forgiveness is so good for your overall mental health, physical health, happiness, flourishing, just on so many levels.
And also, just I love that you brought in God earlier on, that we can be flourishing spiritually
Yeah,
from all of this as well. And and I personally, this is something I've had to learn, and it was something that I knew. I don't think I went into my separation wanting to forgive, like, oh, I can't wait to forgive him.
yeah.
But deep down inside, I knew I needed to. And that was like as far as I could go. And I think that seed of desire, I think God, like me just planting that seed of desire, it gave God something to work with.
Yeah,
And and just from personal experiences, he has been showing me, okay, like this is where you are mentally and this is where you are emotionally. It's not in the great place. So let's clean that up. But as I've been cleaning up, my headspace and my heart space, like in my emotions, um, I've noticed that my relationship with God was getting closer and closer and closer. And the closer I was getting with him, then I noticed that I was trusting him more. And from there, then he just started to like help that need to forgive to grow into a desire where I remember when he was like, I think it's time for you to forgive him. And I was like, can I do that? Like, is that possible? And it took, I didn't pick up the phone that very minute. Like it took me a few days to really believe that I could do it, to believe that I wanted to do it, to believe that I needed to do it. And my capacity to be able to do that. But just from making that decision, allowing to, and then to act on it, like I have noticed that my relationship with my kids are better, my relationship with myself is better, and and we're still separated. So he and we have a really good relationship. Like it's so much better than what it was 2 years ago, because of forgiveness. And so I'm personally grateful because I'm seeing this in my life, you know. And yeah, when I was praying, like I'm just like, I don't know how to do this. Like I had no idea. And so I think also there's wisdom in just being honest with God and be like,
yeah,
I don't know if I want to. Like, like he already knows what's in my heart. So
Yeah.
even if it's, I don't know if I want to right now, but maybe I could in a month. And that gives God something to work with. And so when you are working with people, do you ever bring in, like, you help them to kind of like see their thoughts, like what's going on with their thinking, what's going on emotionally? Do you ever bring in their foundation of faith into the mix of teaching them how to forgive or getting the ball rolling in forgiveness?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's another key distinction about forgiveness is uh, I'm both a Christian and a psychologist.
Yeah.
And in psychological science, we define things in scientific ways. And there are aspects of this discussion that sometimes we just may not have a very good understanding of because they are spiritually mediated. Um, they are a grace of God that we are responding to. Um, the small seed of openness to forgiveness that you're talking about uh, is I think planted by God, and when we're ready to maybe even just water it, even in the slightest bit,
Yeah.
it starts to kind of come to fruition. Um, but I think it's really important that you know some listeners may be very much into their faith, and others may not be. So um, forgiveness can be thought of as both kind of a psychological, scientific kind of topic for which we oftentimes, talk about steps and plans and ways to get from A to Z. Or it can be a very spiritual, faith-based, less objective kind of experience. And I'm perfectly okay with that, right? There's absolutely no
Yeah.
reason why two things can't be true.
Of course.
But I think it's important based on what makes the most sense to someone if they're really engaged in their faith. More of a prayer and a spiritually mediated approach may be useful to them. If they're not so engaged in a faith, then certainly there are still psychological principles and methods for which this can be done. There is even psychological therapy for forgiveness that can be provided. It's not something that I do, but it is available and it can be done. I think it's just it's one of those things that often it can be kind of an elephant in the room, right? There's someone that really doesn't care a whole lot about faith practices or teachings, and it probably isn't going to be terribly helpful to engage in scripture references.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are those that would really benefit from that. And I know for myself, talking about forgiveness and not talking about the faith side of it is it's kind of half the discussion for me. But I'm happy to have it with anyone that's has a more secular or secular humanist kind of perspective. That's fine. It just really depends on the person, depends on what their kind of faith position, the development of their experience of spirituality is like in their life at that moment.
That's great that you can meet the individual or the group of people wherever they are, and that
Yeah.
you have the tools, and you have the tools to work with them and to help them and facilitate forgiveness. And so what so in your years of studying forgiveness, have you come up with steps or ways of achieving or beginning on this path of forgiveness?
Yeah. There's been a lot of research on this, and in science we have kind of two different aspects of research that can be done. One is to do a study and report the results of that study. Another way that sometimes people try to make sense of what we are learning is they do what's called like a systematic review or a meta analysis. Meta means greater than, kind of bigger than something. Um, so when we think about like a meta-analysis, it's an analysis of multiple previous analyses. And some reviews and meta-analyses of the research in this area about how do you help people get from kind of A to Z in terms of the forgiveness
Yeah.
process. This research makes it clear that there's kind of several key pieces that are involved, and I certainly don't want to uh, do an injustice to those models by being too brief about them. But if I could just paint in really broad strokes, a common experience that has to be had is that people have to know what it is they're trying to forgive. That's kind of the
Mm.
starting place. It's kind of like saying, I want to be a better person, but I don't know specifically what I'm going to do, right? And
Yeah.
so you have to have some sort of specific goal, or you can't really know if you've reached it. So if somebody says, well, I really like to be a more honest person. Now that's something I can work with, right? I know what honesty looks like. I know how that can, transpire over time. But to just say I want to be a better person is too vague. So to be specific about what it is that you're trying to forgive, I'm trying to get past the fact that, my spouse really hurt me. I don't know if we'll ever have the same relationship again. Um, that's the thing that happened 3 years ago, or whatever that I'm focusing on. That's kind of step number one, and many of the methods emphasize that step, kind of uncovering, peeling back the layers of the onion to see what is the core root issue of unforgiveness. What is the injustice that has been done that you want to, stay focused on? Number two is often thought to be kind of like a perspective issue. It's often what we kind of think of as an empathy problem. And so this is tough because usually when people hurt us, we'd like to condemn them, and ultimately we wouldn't mind if they were destroyed and probably never brought back into our lives again, right? That would just be an easy out. Um, and you see that, I mean, you see that narrative played out on the Hollywood screen all the time, right? Is that
Yeah.
the bad person gets destroyed or demolished and away, and then life is great from there. It's kind of a classic superhero movie, right? So but empathy kind of asks you as an offended person to consider the offender's perspective and their emotions. And that's really hard because, again, we'd rather distance ourselves from those folks and stay away from them, not try to understand them. But
Yeah.
the key piece here, of course, is that when you empathize with someone, you see the world through their perspective. And when you do that, sometimes you start to understand how they might have acted or behaved or talked in a certain way that was hurtful to you. I'm not saying that you will necessarily condone what they did or say that it's okay.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm saying. But you might, even sometimes reflecting on maybe the way that someone was raised themselves, or the culture that they were in, or the circumstances surrounding uh, the event, that can sometimes really be a critical kind of fulcrum point of going down the forgiveness road, is developing some sense of understanding, at very least some sense of humanizing of the offender, and that in some part, in just recognizing their human dignity, you maybe understand a little bit, and their human brokenness, you understand a little bit about what went into the thing that hurt you. A third piece is understanding that forgiveness is only something that can be given, never required. And I think there's a lot of discussion about this right now, because it's easy for people who have power to demand forgiveness, because they can, they hold all the cards, so they can just say, okay, yeah, I treated you poorly, now forgive me and let's move on. And well, it doesn't
Yeah.
work. No, it doesn't work that way. Uh, Forgiveness is a gift. It cannot be demanded. It cannot be required of someone. And in that way, some would say forgiveness is kind of the greatest example of love. And not just romantic love, relational love, but kind of the notion of altruistic agape love, this idea of unending, abounding love that surrounds us all, more on the level of God's love, not what we oftentimes see it as humans. But so we think about the fact that forgiveness can only be a gift, and in giving that gift, it's not necessarily something that an offender deserves. Or somebody hurt you, they do not deserve your forgiveness. That's not the point. Forgiveness is something that is given despite the fact that it is not deserved, right? That's how gift giving works, right? People don't necessarily deserve the time and attention, the gifts of your time and attention. You just give it freely because you want to experience giving love away, and that's why we do these things. It's a form of altruism. I think oftentimes people get hung up in the sense that, well, they don't deserve it. That's absolutely right. That's the very nature of forgiveness. They don't deserve it. The question is, do you want to withhold it and in so doing continue to suffer yourself,
Yeah.
or do you want to offer it and then hopefully find some relief for yourself? And the key thing is that you don't have to tell your offender that you're forgiving them. You can just do it from within. Sometimes you get into more trouble doing that. Someone says, "Oh, I didn't realize I had even offended you. I'm kind of bothered that you were offended." Oh boy, now you've opened a whole nother. Forgiveness can be, as I said earlier, an intrapersonal event that occurs only within you. It's a gift that you give an offender. They may or may not be aware of it. And then the last couple of things have to do with I talked earlier about the decision to forgive and making that a commitment that you really want to carry forward, remembering your commitment to forgiving, and especially the kind of one of the key last pieces is you're going to be challenged, right? You might finally reach that point where you say, I'm ready, I'm able, I can forgive this person. And the next week you turn around and somebody says, hey, did you know such and such, blah, blah, blah. And, oh my goodness, I thought I had just forgiven this person. Now I hear about what's happened and I'm just inflamed, right? And that's natural, right? That's something that we should expect. And again, to liken it to other kinds of things, exercise programs, diet programs. No one goes into those things thinking it will be easy and that eventually you'll reach a point at which it'll all just be easy, right? That's not how it works. I mean,
Yeah.
to stay fit is a challenge every single day. To eat well is a challenge every single day. To sleep well is a challenge every single day. And to forgive well is a challenge every single day. And just because you encounter challenges and struggles doesn't mean that you're an unforgiving person, doesn't mean that you've blown it and that everything you work toward is gone. In many ways, it's just an opportunity to practice what you've been getting better at. And people will say things all the time about that in other realms of life. They'll say, oh, well, I know I probably should stay away from that because that's loaded with these kinds of nutrients that I don't want. That's an expression of what they've learned and how they've grown. And so it may not get easier, but your ability to meet the challenges, you're more prepared to do them. And you want to, expect that challenges will arise and that you're capable of maintaining forgiveness. You might have to work through the steps again, and that's part of living a forgiving life.
Yeah. And it sounds like it's not just one and done. Like this is a lifestyle. Like
Yeah,
to forgive is to sign up for this kind of lifestyle, this kind of
yeah,
living, like spiritually, mentally, emotionally. And to don't get off
yeah,
the exercise bike. Like you're just still pedaling. You get on there every day and you're still pedaling.
yeah. And I don't want to trivialize. I mean, forgiveness is a really big issue for
Yeah.
people. And so I don't want to trivialize it or make it seem like, well, it's just like riding a bike. Get on it every day and do it. I realize there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, for sure.
But it does become, hopefully, a lifestyle. It's living a forgiving life is what we're aiming for. That's really what we're all about. We're trying to promote that that kind of aspect. And I was just talking with someone the other day that said, organizations change because people change, and cultures change because people change. And we've seen that happen, recently in the United States, that massive social changes have occurred because individuals have changed, and at that level, it's grown and risen to the top. And that's the idea with forgiveness, is that we continue to live a forgiving life that hopefully will, at some point rise to the top, and that will be the way that we orient our communities, our schools and workplaces, our cultures, our countries, and our world.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that vision that you have um, for the world and for all of us. So before we end, I just wanted to just share with you, and I did send this to you. I think yesterday, a case study that a client of mine had sent me, and so, and I'm just going to read parts of this, but and I think a lot of probably what you would say in this situation you may have already stated, and so if anything else comes up, please share.
Yeah, yeah,
But I just wanted to share with the readers what this case study is. And this is what it says. I have tried forgiving my ex for our past many years together and the hurt he caused myself and the kids. But he keeps creating new wounds even though we are divorced, and I try and keep my distance. I keep hearing worse and worse things he's doing to the kids. I pray for the Lord's guidance and direction and angels to surround the kids and myself, but I feel pressured by other members and leaders to keep trying to forgive. I'm not perfect either, but mine are minor things versus his being very traumatic and damaging over and over. And so, and then she asked some questions. What kind of a forgiveness timeline does the Lord give us for those who cause trauma to us, parents, spouses, etc.? What does forgiveness look like to a continuous repeat offender that we try to keep our distance from as much as possible? And steps towards forgiveness. And I know that we had just covered the steps towards forgiveness. But is there any words of wisdom or insight or direction that you would want to share about this case study?
yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I think that's a common experience, that um,
It is.
there's a lot of trauma around difficult family situations. And I've experienced that in my own family as well, that there's lots of just pain and suffering that go on. So I would start by saying, my heart goes out to this person and anyone in these circumstances, especially people that feel vulnerable, threatened, that they might be in harm's way. And just pray for those folks, and especially kids in those circumstances. I think in terms of the notion of forgiveness, we're describing a really complex problem, and one that has really deep hurt involved in it. And this problem is not likely to be solved alone through forgiveness. And so, as I think just about anyone, learning about a situation like this would suggest, there's probably multiple different levels that problems have to be dealt with on. Some of them, may involve just basic, care and safety, and shelter for children, and for those who are maybe in harm's way. Um, so I think that, I wouldn't want someone to think that forgiveness is the answer for all things. I think it's an important part of the answer, and that seeking counseling and seeking help from uh, you know appropriate sources, where those sources of assistance need to come from, is important. And I wouldn't want to diminish this kind of situation by saying, just work on forgiveness and everything will turn out right. That's not true. And
Yeah.
so here's the really difficult thing, I think, and that's that in a perfect world, I I read a philosopher's work on repeated offense and forgiveness recently, and it really rang true for me that in a perfect world, uh, someone might hurt you. Your forgiveness of them would come with a guarantee from them that this kind of hurt or anything even close to it will never happen again in the future. And of course, in that circumstance, kind of forgiveness and justice would be kind of blended together perfectly. You would say, well, I'll forgive you provided that this will never happen again. And, you'd just enjoy a lifetime of protection and a lifetime of freedom through forgiveness. And of course, we don't live in a perfect world. And so when we forgive other people and they sometimes hurt us again, uh, it becomes really challenging and an issue that may, as I said a moment ago, require more than a forgiving response. And that's where it gets really hard to separate the experience of maybe growing hatred or anger or frustration towards someone as they continue to heap insult upon insult, injury upon injury, but maintaining the ability to think about your own, as I said, intrapersonal experience, your own levels of hatred versus forgiveness, and you know trying, it will be hard, but trying to keep that separate from the kind of legal issues that may have to take their course, the kinds of other counseling and care related requirements that will kind of run their course, um, and maintaining some, as much as possible, some clarity and distinction between things that are going to happen in this imperfect world to ensure safety and some level of justice, and your own experience of that and processing that. I mean, I come back to our Lord Jesus, who says that you forgive. I think you mentioned earlier 7 times 70, and that means infinitely. And that's what we're called to do, and that's what we'll try to do as Christians. Will we be perfectly capable of that? Undoubtedly, no. I think that the Lord's timeline here is likely an infinite one, right? I couldn't speak on his behalf. I would never try to say what I think God is thinking. I mean, that's larger than me and larger than all of us. But I do have to believe somewhere in my heart that the truth of the matter is that you're trying and you're
Yeah.
remaining open. You're remaining open to this and you're praying about it. And, other parts of the complexity of this equation are going to play out. And then you're left with how do you feel about this? And that's where you have complete control. And it's a matter of thinking through the value and your call to forgiveness, both here and now and in hereafter. So, I have lots of compassion for people, in so many people in these difficult circumstances. The pain and the suffering is just immeasurable. And I would, maybe just end by saying, in these kinds of situations, maybe one thing that forgiveness offers is the opportunity not to add additional pain and suffering where there's already going to be a lot to contend with. So, difficult things. I would encourage people to, ask about forgiveness therapy. Consider the possibility of spending time, dedicated time, working on forgiveness. But know very clearly, it's not, if you can't forgive, it's, I don't think it's something that is, makes someone a bad person. It's something that you're probably still working on, and you hope that one day you will reach that point.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for just highlighting the complexity of life and situations and circumstances, and that it's not the it's not the only Band-Aid.
Right.
Forgiveness isn't the only Band-Aid. It's not the
Yeah.
only ointment, but it's one of many. It's one of many. And so before we end, I just want to ask you one more question, one last question. And it is, what does it mean to lead with grace when it comes to forgiveness?
Well, that's a fantastic ending point, and I think I can sum it up by saying leading with grace is being open to the gifts that we've been given, and forgiveness is the number one gift that we've been given. Uh, if you've been given forgiveness, and you have been, um, the call is to act in kind, right? To return the gift you've received by offering that gift to others whenever possible, as much as possible, with all who are possible to give it to. It's a really high call, and believe me, I sympathize with everyone that struggles with it, because I too, struggle with it. Just because I've studied it for a long time doesn't by any means mean that it's easy for me. Uh, and so I think that's really what it means. It's a gift that we've been given that we're asked to also give.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your insights, and your personal testimony of the truthfulness of this beautiful principle of forgiveness. And thank you, everyone, for jumping on here and being with us on this conversation about forgiveness and how it can be a blessing in your life, and to be able to work with God and how to implement this in your life in whatever circumstance that you are involved in right now and struggling with. And so I will make sure to have all of the contact information of Dr. Toussaint's in the show notes, and how you can get more information in regard to this global initiative that he is a part of. And if there are listeners that want to be part of this initiative, is that a possibility, or what's the involvement there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we're looking for partners, organizations, champions, especially people in counseling and faith leadership roles, teachers, even policymakers, leaders in the community, mayors, governors, anyone that believes that, as we do, the message of forgiveness needs to be out there more commonly. It needs to be something we lead with, not that we, lack with so often. So, yeah, the opportunities to get involved are endless, I think, and I would absolutely welcome that.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for that. And again, I'll make sure that all that information will be in the show notes so that you can follow through and contact or get involved in any way that you so desire. Thank you again, everyone, and I will see you later.